As a teenager, Sam Momo Giancana was a member of the notorious 42 gang, where he earned his reputation as an outstanding getaway driver or wheelman. His first arrest came in September 1925 for grand theft auto. Before his 20th birthday, he was picked up 3 more times. Once for suspicion of murdering a witness to a robbery case and the other for the killing of Octavius Grenady, a black man running for office in the heavily Italian 20th Ward. On September 17, 1926, Giancana was indicted for murder. He was the teenage wheelman in an incident with other 42's gang members when they robbed a middle-aged barber named William Gerard. When Gerard resisted, they shot and killed him. A cab driver identified Giancana, who was arrested. The police worked him over for a few days, but he wouldn't squeal and did his time. In November of 1928, Giancana was arrested for attempted burglary of a clothing store. He pleads guilty and was sentenced to 1 to 5 at Statesville Prison. He was released on Christmas Eve, 1932, and he went to work for Paul Ricca. In May of 1939, Sam was arrested again and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison Leavenworth. The charge was for moonshining. He had been caught in a barn in Elgin, Illinois, with 8,800 gallons of mash, 1,000 gallons of alcohol, and 1,000 gallons of spirits. Giancana was transferred from Leavenworth to Terre Haute, Indiana, where he tested 74 on verbal intelligence and 93 on nonverbal. He registered for the draft, but was appointed F4. He is a constitutional psychopath with an inadequate personality manifested by strong antisocial tendencies, the report read. In 1942, gangster Murray Humphreys hired members of the 42 gang, which still included Giancana, as well as Marshal Cafano, Tietz Battaglia, and others, to guard the bosses while Roger Touhy's gang was on the run from prison. In 1943, Giancana kidnapped Jake Guzak and held him in an empty building and gave him a choice: turn over a gift of $250,000 in exchange for support and acceptance from the outfit. Otherwise, they would kill him. Guzak accepted the offer for the money, vowed his support, and was driven to West Roosevelt Road and released. In about 1943, Giancana grew close to Little New York Campagna, Tony Accardo, and Joe Fusco. When it looked like Accardo would go to jail on a tax charge, Campagna told him, "You're next in line." In June of 1953, Giancana may have ordered the kidnap murder of politician Clem Graver, who refused to pay his kidnappers. They never found his body. By 1954, Sam Giancana was underboss to Accardo, but, as his daughter wrote, "I had a feeling at times that Dad was like a peon to them, yet it was during these years that they both gave Sam more and more responsibility." She was right, of course. Paul Ricca acted as though he was fond of Giancana, but he detested him according to sources, and, in the end, Accardo probably ordered his death. In December 1959, Tony Accardo had a lot on his mind. The Internal Revenue was all over him, and Paul Ricca was in constant trouble with the Immigration and Naturalization Service. After the raid on Appalachia, the FBI snapped to life, and now Chicago was crawling with agents who were suddenly investigating every aspect of the mob's business. It was a dangerous time to be the boss, just as it had been back in 1933 when Ricca slyly set up Frank Nitti as the outfit's leader so that Ricca could operate unnoticed behind the scenes. By 1959, Ricca had learned that the federal government's resources were limited when it came to combating organized crime. If federal prosecutors couldn't nail the biggest, the most powerful bosses, they simply went for the largest and flashiest mark and left the others alone. So in 1959, Ricca and Accardo decided to make Sam Giancana the government's newest target. They promoted him to boss and told the world that they were retired. An FBI informant told the Bureau in 1959 that Giancana wasn't really the boss and that the only person of any importance in the Mafia and the National Syndicate who believed that Giancana was the boss was Giancana himself and a few yes-men who worked under him. Accardo called his top men to a meeting at Mio's restaurant. However, Mio's was too staid for Giancana's taste. His favorite hangout was the Pink Clock Bar, where he would meet his mistress for whom he kept an apartment. However, Giancana would later put the Mio brothers in charge of the Villa Venice, a rundown place he purchased on Milwaukee Avenue in rural Wheeling. Giancana poured a small fortune into the place, redecorated it, and opened a casino in the back. He could afford it. By 1959, Giancana's take from Las Vegas was estimated to be $300,000 a month. After a quick dinner in Mio's back room, Accardo, a man of few words under the best of occasions, rose to his feet and announced that he was stepping down as the boss and that Sam Giancana would take his place. "This is Sam," Accardo mumbled. "He's a friend of mine." It was, as Ovid de Maris pointed out, a coronation ceremony was deceptively simple. Accardo merely placed a hand on Giancana's shoulder and said, "I want you to meet my friend, Sam Giancana." Giancana was 49 when he took over the Chicago outfit. A baby by mafia standards. Mo Dalitz and Murray Humphreys, who had the utmost respect for Tony Accardo, could never understand why Accardo would sanction the rise of a dolt like Sam Giancana to head up the Chicago family. Like most people in the underworld, they felt that Sam Battaglia should have been named boss instead of Giancana because Battaglia was calmer and more level-headed, even though he lacked Giancana's intelligence. Many soldiers in the outfit and more than a few connected guys were outraged that Giancana got the job because they knew how hyper and hot-tempered he was. Most considered him a danger to himself and to them. Giancana's rise in the outfit was helped by the aging and increased wealth of the mob elders. By 1959, he had come to power. By then, he had been arrested at least 63 times and had served time for auto theft, burglary, and moonshining. He had killed an estimated 200 men and had 14 different aliases, however his favorites would remain Sam Flood and Mr. Gold. He could be charming and likable. He was shy around those he didn't know, more prone to listen than to talk. He could also be childishly vain, wearing expensive toupees that cost him $1,000. His clothes were monogrammed and he had a solid gold keychain and diamond chips on his wristwatch. He owned a solid gold swizzle stick. He smoked foot-long cigars and drove loud-colored Cadillacs, wore sharkskin suites, alligator shoes, and silk shirts. On his right hand he wore a massive star sapphire pinky ring, a gift from Frank Sinatra. Like Frank Nitti, Giancana was always trying to better himself. He was remarkably well-read, by mob standards. He studied antiques, particularly bisque and porcelain figurines, and became an avid collector. He sent his girls to the most expensive and best Catholic finishing schools in the Midwest. When served a dish that was expensive, he would say, "I wonder what the poor are eating tonight." However, he still ate in his old neighborhood at the Vernon Park Inn at Vernon Park and Aberdeen, where the bill seldom came to over $3.00 for an enormous meal. Sam Tufano, known as Papa Ozique, a fat, robust little man, owned one of those places. He had once cooked for Al Capone. Giancana could be encouraging to friends and family. He was generous to a fault. He could be caring and find time to hear out any soldier's or friend or family member's problem. After his wife Angeline died in 1954, he was always on the make for a woman, and all he asked was that she have a nice figure and a pretty face, nothing more, nothing less. He had a soundproofed cellar conference room in his Oak Park home at 1147 Winona Avenue. To look at Sam Giancana in 1957 was to see the very embodiment of a gangster, and everyone took notice, including the federal government, which was exactly the plan that Accardo and Ricca had in mind. Acting as Giancana's guide to running the mob was Tony Accardo, who would never step completely down from his spot as boss of the mob. Tony Accardo was a peasant but a reserved man and a thinker. Giancana was a hyper-aggressive personality. Another difference between Sam Giancana and Accardo and Ricca, aside from Accardo and Ricca's superior intelligence, was that Accardo and Ricca knew how to stick to business. Even Frank Nitti knew how to stick to business. Giancana didn't, and that was how he got involved with one of the stupidest affairs the Chicago group had ever become entangled in, the CIA plot to kill Castro. Like Accardo, Giancana lost money in Cuba, not the millions that Accardo lost, but still it was more than he could afford to lose. Behind Accardo was Paul Ricca, who would act as advisor to Giancana even though he disliked him. Like Accardo, Ricca would remain a power behind the throne. As his underboss, Giancana chose Frankie Strong. Another childhood friend, Butch Blasey, would be bodyguard, appointment secretary, driver, and confidant. Blasey was also a collector who delivered cash to Accardo, Ricca, and Giancana. Giancana's loud style and fascination with Hollywood brought around the federal government, and in October of 1962, while Sam was out of town, Accardo and Ricca met with the political bosses who said that they had never seen things so bad before. On May 14, 1965, Giancana was called in before a federal grand jury in Chicago and questioned for 3 days about the structure of the National Commission in an effort by the Organized Crime Unit to break the inner circle of the Chicago Mafia in an effort to keep outsiders from knowing who may or may not have talked. The DOJ flooded the field of potential informants by calling in everybody and anybody related to organized crime, including Charlie English, Fifi Bucheri, Gussie Alex, John Darko, Pat Marcid, Ben Jacobian of the First Ward, Anthony Touhy, and Frank Annunzio, with whom Touhy was now the aide for as well. When Giancana was incited and refused to provide any information to a grand jury, and was jailed as a result. On June 1, 1965, Giancana was brought before Judge William S. Campbell. "Do you continue to refuse?" Campbell asked. "Yes, sir." Giancana was ordered jailed again until he talked or until the grand jury was dismissed, telling Giancana, "You have the key to your own cell." A year passed before he was released. By that time, the Justice Department had him lined up to appear at 2.5 years' worth of grand jury hearings. However, Giancana talked to the CIA and threatened to go public with the plots to kill Castro, and the Justice Department backed off. According to Giancana, after he was released from jail, Accardo had all but ordered him out of Chicago. He was humiliated, and he swore he would never forget the treatment he had suffered at Accardo's hand. The whole outfit was treating him like a punk, and he resented it. He had earned them, Ricca and Accardo and other, millions, maybe hundreds of millions, and now he was a nobody. In fact, an FBI informant reported that it was widely agreed nobody is happy with Sam's release and that he has to go or he'll drag us all down the drain with him. On November 16, 1966, another informant reported that the bosses have placed a hit out on Giancana. On January 19, 1967, Giancana told an informant that he intended to go to an island and relax for the rest of my life. "I'll leave everything behind. They can have everything I got." That statement, and others like it, were reported back to Ricca and Accardo, who feared it was Giancana's way of saying that he was going to flip over to the FBI. They also wondered openly why he had not been subpoenaed since his release. But, by then Giancana had left Chicago for Mexico. However, before he left, his gambling club, the Villa Venice, exploded in a fireball for no apparent reason. Gangster John Darko handled the insurance claim through his company Arco Insurance. By 1968, Tony Accardo wanted some of the millions that were pouring into Sam Giancana's gambling operations in Mexico and elsewhere. However, Giancana felt that he had built the empire of gambling cruise ships and several illegal casinos around the world, and he had no intention of splitting his share with anyone. He did give his bodyguard ex-cop Richard Kane a fair share because he had helped to build the operation, but since Accardo had all but thrown him out of Chicago, Giancana considered himself an independent agent. He was also still smarting over the fact that when he had taken over the black policy in the 40s, that Ricca and Accardo hadn't supported him with any of the cost of paying off judges or providing him with muscle, yet he was obligated to kick almost all of the money he made back up to them. Even when he was the boss, he still felt that he wasn't getting his fair percentage from the black policy rackets and was smarting because he had to cut his share of the money with capos who now ran the territory. Accardo sent Butch Blasey, who was now his bodyguard and driver, just as Sam had once been, to tell Giancana that Accardo wanted to have a sit-down, but Giancana told Blasey to tell Accardo to go to hell. One morning in 1972, Giancana awoke around 9:30 in the morning and stepped out into the walled garden that surrounded his estate in Mexico. It had been a reasonably good year. He had spent Christmas in Santa Monica with his new girlfriend and New Year's on the beach at Waikiki. His casinos were earning him millions upon millions of dollars. Suddenly 2 men jumped out from behind the large trees and dragged him to the ground, handcuffed him and threw him into a car marked immigration that had been waiting in the front of the house. He was tossed in the back seat and stripped of his silk pajamas and handed a blue work shirt and a pair of overalls 3 times his size. Sam demanded to see his Mexican lawyer Jorge Castillo, but Castillo was no fool. When he found out that Mexican federal officials didn't want any more protection money from Giancana, he figured the end was near for the Chicago hood and disappeared for a while. What had happened was that the United States government had applied pressures to Mexican officials as to why a hood like Giancana was allowed to remain in their country for 8 years on a temporary resident alien status. The immigration car drove to the airport and threw Giancana on the first plane bound north for America. 30 minutes later, Momo Giancana was in San Antonio, Texas, without a penny to his name, wearing a pair of pants that would have fallen off of him had he let go of his grip. In San Antonio, 2 FBI agents served Giancana with a subpoena and put him on a plane to Chicago, where more agents were waiting with more subpoenas. Among the agents was Bill Romer, who had berated Giancana at that same spot 12 years before in 1962. Romer was shocked at what he saw. He wrote later Sam looked like some Italian immigrant landing at Ellis Island, destitute and frail. The intelligence unit for Chicago police hauled him away for questioning in the Dick Kane murder. He met with the grand jury 4 times, but was evasive, preferring a perjury charge to another contempt citation. He told his children and his in-laws that he would do anything to keep from rotting away in jail, but kept sending word to Accardo that he would never talk to the feds. But somebody close to Giancana got word to Accardo that Giancana said he would do anything to keep from rotting in jail. By that time, the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, chaired by Idaho's Frank Church, was looking into the CIA monkeyshines over the past 30 years and wanted to talk to Giancana about his involvement in the CIA plan to kill Fidel Castro. Johnny Rosselli testified first and Sam was scheduled to go next, but in May of 1975, he fell ill with gallbladder problems. He flew to Houston for a cholecystectomy and then returned home to 1147 South Winona, Oak Park, where he was taken care of by his youngest daughter Francine. On the night he was killed, Sam Giancana took an early nap. Later his daughter Francine and her husband, Jerry, arrived. A few minutes later Butch Blasey and Chucky English showed up. Outside, the Chicago Police Intelligence Unit was watching the house from across the street. They had a small party celebrating Sam's return to good health. At about 10 the party broke up. Seeing the guests leave, the police car across the street drove over to up-and-coming hood Tony Spilatro's house a few blocks away and waited for Spilatro to come home. About a half an hour after his guests left, Sam cooked the Italian sausage, escarole, and CC beans that Francine had brought over. A few minutes later Francine came back to the house at about 10:15 to retrieve her purse. On the way back out to the car, Francine noticed Butch Blasey returning to the house as well, but thought nothing of it. 15 minutes later, at about 10:30 Joe DePercio, Sam's groundskeeper who lived in the house with his wife, called down the stairs to tell Sam that he was going to watch the Johnny Carson show on television and then go to bed. Did Sam need anything? No, he replied, he was going to bed himself. Giancana turned on one of his 2 favorite movies, both Sinatra films, The Man with the Golden Arm and The Manchurian Candidate. Then there was a knock on the door. Giancana trusted whoever it was and let them in. Then Giancana walked over to the small stove to cook his CC beans. When somebody put the .22 to the back of his head, they shot him in the throat and mouth to show that they thought that he had been talking. The other bullets were put into his brain, fired as the shooter stood over Sam's dead body. The killer took Sam's wallet out of his back pocket, he ruffled through it, left the credit cards and almost $1,500 in place, and then threw the wallet across the room. The killer was somebody that Giancana trusted, otherwise he never would have been allowed in the apartment. Joe DePercio called down to Sam before he went to sleep for the night. There was no answer, but the lights were on and he could smell the sausage burning on the stove and walked downstairs to find Giancana. The murder weapon was found on the side of Thatcher Road, which led to River Forest where Butch Blasey lived. The FBI reconstructed the scene. Based on the time that Giancana was killed, about 10:35, the killer's car was headed down Thatcher Road. Records showed that a squad car was screaming up the road as well. The shooter panicked and tossed the murder weapon out the car window. Butch Blasey was the popular suspect by everyone except FBI man Bill Romer, who suspected that although Blasey may have helped to set Giancana up for the killing, he didn't actually pull the trigger. So ended the bloody reign that counted at least 79 known murders. The mob showed its contempt for Sam Giancana by staying away from his funeral. Of the hundreds of wise guys that Giancana had gone up with and ruled over, only Butch Blasi and Chucky English showed up for his funeral.